A very good morning, Professor Prasenjit Dora, Director of Asia Research Institute and Director of Research, Humanities and Social Sciences at the National University of Singapore, distinguished speakers and session chairpersons, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the inaugural seminar of the Indian Heritage Center, titled People, Ports and Places, the Narrative of Indian Communities in Singapore and Southeast Asia. This seminar over today and tomorrow will explore the themes of roots and Indians and Little Indias in Southeast Asia. This seminar is a milestone for the Indian Heritage Center, or IHC in short, and is one of the programming activities which will lead up to the center's opening in 2 years in 2015. Without further ado, it's my pleasure now to invite Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Ambassador at Large, and Chairman of the IHC Concept and Content Subcommittee, member of IHC Steering Committee, and Chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies, to deliver the welcoming remarks. Ambassador Pillai, please.
Mr. Professor Prasenjit Dora, our guest of honor, Mr. Ong Yu Huat, Chairman of NHB, Mrs. Rosa Daniel, CEO of NHB, Ambassador Keshav Pani, and all distinguished speakers, guests, a very good morning and welcome to this function. Before I start, I want to first thank the Hindi Society and Mr. Srinivas Rai for making this space available to us. Another person I should recognize in connection with the Gandhi Memorial is Mr. Amir Ali Jumaboy, because his father was pivotal he played a pivotal role in building this edifice. And we had this building thanks to the work put in by his father. Now, my speech, Gauri, being a very efficient lady, has already printed my speech. In the program. And if I were to read it, I think you will pelt me with eggs. But I have no intention to read it. I must assume that all of you can read and write, and therefore you can read it, taken as read. That being the case, I want to spend this few minutes to talk about the background of this IHC. It is normally the fashion in Singapore for the speakers to start off by saying, I have 3 points or I have 5 points. I'm sorry, I can't follow this tradition, mainly because, one, I don't know how many points I'm going to make, or whether I'm going to make a point at all. And also, if I say 5, and by the time I read 3, I probably would have forgotten the other 2. So I will just coast along and tell you a few things, which is basically the background of IHC. When IHC was first mooted, the Indian Heritage Center was first mooted, it was supposed to have been an initiative of the community. Some piece of land was made, a property was made available, and some small money was earmarked. And the community was asked to go and build it. Now, you know that the resources of the community is very limited, highly stretched, and the government gave it a great deal of thought and came to the conclusion that they would fund it. And this is a fantastic decision by the government. They gave us a piece of land, a triangular, rather funny-looking piece of land, at the junction of Clive Street and Campbell Lane. Now, the rest of Singapore, you know, when you say Singapore is solid as a rock, it is literally true, because the rest of Singapore rests on a rock, except Serangoon Road. Serangoon Road area is very mushy ground. So we had a challenge actually doing the construction on the property. But the location was ideal in that it was in the heart of Little India. And we decided that we will take it. And government gave us, I don't know what the exact figure is, a substantial amount of money, about more than $25,000. And with that, we... Sorry, $25 million. Sorry. $25 million. And that was a very sizable amount of money to build it. So we need more money, yes, that's true, but that's not the topic of my discussion. What I wanted to say was that after that, once this was an indication of the importance the government places on the cultural heritage of Singapore. We celebrate our multiracial cultural heritage. I was sad to read an article by Professor Lim Kiam Heng, I think his name was, professor in history in University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur. And he has written an article saying that a site was discovered in somewhere in Johor of an ancient city which was more than 500 years ahead of the Malacca Sultanate. But somehow it was decided for political reasons, I don't know whether this is true, that's what he says, that no publicity would be given and this whole thing was probably covered up or left to oblivion sort of thing. But Singapore doesn't do that. That is a very remarkable thing. Now, once the decision has been taken to actually set it up, organizing committee originally under the chairmanship of the late Dr. Balaji, Mrs. Balaji is here, and then when he passed on, we had Mr. Ishwaran. We have a team of management which is very dedicated, and we have a committee which is equally passionate. We have taken a very calibrated process. We have put in place a very calibrated process. We started by having a number of consultations with community organizations. I think we met, Pani, myself, and the other committee members, we met more than 50 organizations from the community to get their views, their expectations, what are their priorities, and so on. Then we decided to go on to a design competition for the building. There are quite a number of submissions. A panel was set up to shortlist 3 or 4, and the shortlisted ones were exhibited in various venues. One was in Serangoon Road, and we got feedback. And then finally, the final one was selected. So there has been very close involvement of the community in the whole process. And today's seminar is the first of what we will be doing, in that it's a build-up for the actual completion of the project and the inauguration of the project sometime in 2015. Now, once the building is up and the artifacts, when we chose, we had one guiding principle, that when we say Indian Heritage Center, it actually means the Indian subcontinent, not the geographical area that is India today, but the Indian subcontinent as we know it. We are approaching the various community organizations which has got its own building, which have their own buildings, to create little cultural centers in their premises. Let's say the Punjabis, they have many buildings, or the UP, or the Malayalis, or the Telugus. If they can have a cultural center of their own and link it to the Indian Heritage Center, it's a hub and spoke concept. That's what we want to develop. And we will also need the community's help to translate many of the narratives that will be heard when somebody visits these centers. The main languages will be there, but we will also have access to other languages which are not our official languages, and then we will have them. So the work is going on, and this seminar, I'm very thankful to the large number of very distinguished speakers, and also particularly to my good friend, Professor Prasenjit Dwara, for sparing the time here. And for you to be here, that makes the day for us, the 2 days for us. And we hope it'll be a successful one. We'll frank discussions. We will get a lot of takeaways from this. And we will, ultimately, we want to set up the Indian Heritage Center as a landmark, an iconic center reflecting the multicultural heritage of Singapore. Thank you very much.
Next, we'd like to invite our guest of honor, Professor Prasenjit Dora, to deliver his keynote address. Professor, please.
Thank you, Professor Ambassador Pillai, and to Gauri, and congratulations to the Indian Heritage Center for taking off and for its inaugural seminar. So I want to look at how and why narratives are constructed, how and why narratives are formed, why narratives are developed in the world, and ultimately because, you know, we think narrative is something not to be thought about. Like a lot of history, people don't think about it. They just say, oh, memorize it and you'll know it, or listen to it and you get it down. But I think it's very important to think about how narratives are constructed, what is the purpose, what is the goal, what do they do, right? First thing we have to understand is that narratives give coherence and significance to bits and pieces of history, culture, of everyday events, linking everyday events to big events and all of those kinds of issues. Let me start with a few examples. For instance, if you look at Indian history and the way you were taught, I'm not sure if you were taught with those materials in Singapore, but in India at least, when I was growing up, we had a very clear Nehruvian vision of Indian history. And then soon after I left India, I realized also there was very much a Hindu version of Indian history. And these narratives were quite different. But there were not just these two. There were several different narratives of Indian history. And let's see what they do. The different leaders. Actually, the earliest of the narratives of modern India and Indian history, not modern India, Indian history, is sort of looking at what sort of unifies the diverse peoples of India and so on. And if you go all the way from there's a whole Bengali, there's a Bengali Bhadralok tradition, right? Which goes from Ram Mohan Roy to Vivekananda, Aurobindo Ghosh, and probably contemporary versions as well, which really talks about the spiritual unity of India, that the unity of India is not so much material, linguistic, and so on, but then Indians have a certain orientation towards spiritual culture, and this is what has unified Indians over time, or people who live on the subcontinent over time, and we have to recover this. Of course, one of the great successors to this narrative, although he combined many others, was Gandhi, in whose, and he articulated perhaps the most important and, well, I don't know about workable, but also practicable version of it. Then you have, of course, the Hindu Mahasabha with its contemporary successors, the Hindutva people, who also thought in terms of religion, but not so much religion of Hinduism, but not so much Hinduism as a spiritual movement, but Hinduism, what they called Hindutva. Veer Savarkar called it Hindutva as a way of life, so that he wanted to think of Hindus as a kind of a people, a race even. Those days, the ideas of race were very important. Hindus as a race. And that obviously had different implications. And then you have some versions of it, including Golwalkar and people like that, thought of Hindus as a race, excluding, as a thought of Hindus as a race that were Aryan, right? So what happens to the so-called non-Aryan peoples all around, who also happen to be Hindus, right? They don't have much of a chance there. Or you can aspire to it, but that's it. So you have that kind of narrative, that this is what, Hindutva has been what. It was very interesting. I went to the Indian National Museum about 15 years ago and went to see the Indus Valley Civilization segment, which has some very interesting materials. But the interpretation, that was the time when the NDA, is it, was in power, and the Hindutva people were very influential. And it was very interesting that the framing of the Indus Valley was very much as if it was a Hindu civilization, right? And we all know that, there's the other side of the argument that Hinduism came with the Aryans and so on, or emerged from the Aryans, but then you transport it back all the way. You have these kalashas and so on that are strewn about there, and everything is interpreted as if it was. So you can see how this narrative tries to fix a certain type of meaning to it. Then you have Nehru, which I think is very interesting about how he establishes the narrative. For someone like Nehru, the unity of India, what held India together, the narrative there, is not religion or race. It is for him land and culture. And I quote here from his Discovery of India: "Those who professed a religion of non-Indian origin coming to India, settled down there, became distinctively Indian in the course of a few generations. It would seem," and then from another page, "it would seem that every outside element that has come to India and been absorbed by India has given something to India and taken much from her. It has contributed to its own and to India's strength." Well, I'm very pleased that I was reared in a tradition in which this was the dominant view, a very capacious view, something that, and he felt always that India always had this capaciousness to absorb and to exchange and keep within. And India is seen, of course, not within its territorial borders, but that area, that region. And of course, for him, politics was very important because, after all, he was the state builder and nation builder. And so the high points within this narrative. So then, I'm just giving you the elements, the factors of production of narrative, right? What is the main thing here? Then the narrative itself is sort of constructed around it. And for him, the high points of the narrative are, of course, the great unifiers, so starting with Ashoka, of course, and the Indian symbol is very much the pillar of Ashoka. Ashoka, Akbar, Gandhi, these are the people who brought different peoples in and created a system which could allow them to have what he would call, of course, unity in diversity. Now, let me talk a little bit, as I said, theoretically, about, now that I've given you the pictures, about what the narrative is. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur talks about, what he talks about is narrative is a very adequate means of expressing what he calls historicality. What is historicality? Historicality is the tendency among people, among humans, whether as communities or as individuals, to be able to, a human tendency to reach back into the past in order to think about the future, right? So there's always a stretching back and linking. You're always, whenever you have a project, you create the India Heritage Center, you're looking for something of your past in order to fulfill that project. So it is that meaning-giving enterprise. And so this is, as you can see, a time-based thing, a temporal process, right? And for that, Ricoeur says that the main mode that humans have to address that question is narrativity, right? And so that's what a narrative does. So narrative in this sense is the sense of giving meaning to, whether it's an individual, to a community or something, to sort of collect your experiences and go forward, which is what all humans have to do. So, and of course, we have all forms of narrative, right? History is a modern form of narrative which has a scientific basis. We talk about evidential history. You need to back up what you say. But you have all kinds of histories, right? You have all kinds of narratives. You have myths, legends, cinematic stories. And these have all, even rituals can express some, they can embody. You have visual narratives, that depict. I wish I'd brought some pictures. I've shown enough to enough people in Singapore that they'll be repetitive. So you have these things, and all of these are meaning-giving ones. What is interesting is that modern historical narratives, of course, have also the power of being able to understand what the narrative is about. when you have myths and legends and so on, you don't like to reflect on them, and it takes away. And even with modern history, if you reflect too much, then you can't feel sure that what you're doing is good, right? Because you always see some bad side of it. But there are two elements in narrative, the meaning-giving element and what we can call the power element. The power element is a very important element because community making is also an activity of power, right? Because when you construct a narrative, you create an inclusive versus an exclusive narrative, right? And this is a very important part of it. I've already given some indications of who gets excluded, why, in the earlier Nehruvian Hindutva kinds of narratives. So, narratives, not only the power element, not only excludes people without a history. So, for instance, if you look at world narratives, people who were considered in the modern era, in the imperialist period, people who were ordinary, the people from what we now call tribal societies, indigenous peoples, were people who were considered without a history and therefore without able to. So their myths, legends, versions of themselves were considered not fit for civilized world. And if they were without a history, they were not really a people, they could be dispensed with, right? So it is an important enabling act, but it's also a disabling act, right? Somebody else's narrative can disable other people. Now, narratives can be very powerful. Narratives can also sustain enmities. All we have to think of are the India-Pakistan ones. Of course, there are lots of counter-narratives, but there are the hardliners have basic narratives that are exclusive. Sino-Japanese ones, or so many other, you can get those kinds of narratives that sustain enmities. And we have, of course, the diaspora, which is a community in formation, community in making, all diasporas. That's why we give them a name. Diaspora narratives, it was interesting to think about what were pre-modern, pre-national diaspora narratives. And there are some which we can think of. But very interesting to think of what a diaspora narrative is in modern times. My main experience has been with, I've done a little study of the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. So what you see is that diasporas have all kinds of narratives. And it's really a very interesting space of jostling narratives, because you have narratives of, for instance, the Chinese diaspora had a narrative. How am I doing for time? I'm sorry, I do? Okay, good. The diaspora, the Chinese diaspora, for instance, had lots of different narratives. There was one, when they first came, long before modern nationalism and so on, it was an opposition to the Manchu invasion of China, and a small bunch escaped from China and created the whole basis of Chinese communities here. Then there were others who were, of course, the early Chinese traders were very important in setting up relationship between becoming business links with the sultans and the kings and so on of this area. And they established certain stories, and they were very much integrated. This, of course, to some extent, the ancestors of the Peranakans. And then you have later narratives get increasingly influenced by nationalisms. And they get influenced by nationalisms not only of the Chinese nation state, but also local narratives. So you have Teochew narratives. And there, in some ways, maybe the principal competitor was, there were many different competitors, but could have been the Hokkien or the Cantonese, based on, competition within. I'm sure we will recognize this even more in the Indian case, right? And so what you get among diasporas is precisely because of the greater multiplicity of their experiences in different places and so on. You have, of course, many more possibilities. And I think that can actually be a strength. So that And you have different nationalist groups, whether in China or in India, that seek to work on the diaspora one way or the other, to make them into nationals or to make them into a particular version of the national narrative, or to make them just local, whether it's a Sindhi narrative or a Gujarati narrative or a Tamil narrative, which is, of course, a very important and serious narrative here. But it seems to me that the strength of it is that precisely because diaspora people have in their life experiences, in their immediate past experiences, have to contend with so many different peoples, so many different communities, so many different power structures, states, and so on, and have to make a life in a new space, right? Or a new space. And since these are spaces for diaspora, there are always new communities coming in as well, right? It seems that their narrative should have the greatest resilience, the greatest capacities to be able to create linkages. Ambassador Pillai talked about the spoke and hub and spokes, right? And I think that that's a very interesting way also to think about how, it's also very interesting to see how do you visualize narratives, right? Where do they end up? Where do they not? And the problem with, if you compare narratives from the pre-modern era, especially if you look at legends and myths and so on, with the modern historical narratives, there's one very important difference, right? As I said, the modern narrative is evidential and has a scientific basis. But what it then does, it negates the non-scientific basis of narrative, right? The rhetorical, the inspirational foundations of narrative. Modern historical consciousness does not have the capacity to deal with that. Whereas with myths and legends, that's the main thing, right? But if you think about it, when modern historical narratives, they deal only with humans, community actors, and so on. Those are the actors in a narrative. Whereas if you look at a myth, you have gods, you have other cosmologies, you have times, you have animals, whether it's Sun Wukong or some kind of Garuda or something like that, Hanuman. You have all these people play very important critical roles in their narratives. But I think there is a certain capaciousness in that. I think there's a recognition that humans are not the only ones who create narratives, that the narratives are formed by all kinds of natural elements as well as by all kinds of forces we have no control over, right? Like climate change, for instance, right? Or perhaps we should have control, but we have to find ways of building them into our narratives. So I think that's the kind of capaciousness that exists in pre-modern narratives, and that I think diasporas also are faced with that multiplicity of actors. These are not necessarily non-human actors, but I don't see why they can't be. In this time and age, they do play a role in our history, and certainly in our arts and so on. So I think we need to look at older narrative modes before the advent of nation states and nationalism, including legends and myths, which link humans to more universal, more cosmological goals. That is to say that a single human or community is not the single owner or agent of a narrative. And we shouldn't think of this. Now what we have done is we've reduced any story that has animals and so on in it to a kid's story, right? It doesn't have to be. We can begin to take it increasingly seriously. And I would suggest that my proposal is that we link that diasporic communities need to link their narratives to global processes because they are products of global processes. They're often beneficiaries of global processes, and they can also be victims of global processes. And in this, it is very important to have spaces in your narratives which don't end up celebrating just oneself, but to see a greater role for others, particularly in an era where planetary sustainability is in danger. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dora. And now we have the Center Director, Gauri Krishna, Dr. Gauri Krishna with us to present a token of appreciation to Professor Dora.